Welcome back to Ladies of Another View. And we have joining us Mark Meckler, who's the president of the Convention of the States. He's a political activist, which means a troublemaker, right? But our kind of trouble. And he's also the founder of the Tea Party. Welcome to the show, Mark Meckler.
Hey, it's really great to be with you today.
Hey, Mark.
We absolutely want to hear about the Convention of the States. There's so much going on right now, but I'm fascinated. You're the guy that started the Tea Party. How did that come about?
Well, I want to push back a little bit on that because people say that to me a lot, and there were a lot of people involved in the early days of the Tea Party movement, but I would actually, in that regard, give credit to God. Saying that somebody founded the Tea Party movement is like a surfer coming out of the ocean after riding the perfect wave, and you say, hey, thanks for creating that great wave. I mean, the reality is that the Tea Party, I think, existed in the hearts and minds of the American people. People were fed up, frustrated, taxed enough already. And a few of us got together and we sensed that energy, ultimately founded an organization called the Tea Party Patriots that gave it a home for all that energy. And it was really just, like I said, I think God was acting on the hearts and minds of the American people. And I got involved because I saw Rick Santelli's rant on CNBC. He said the federal government was out of control, that we should hold a Tea Party. So a group of us got together and decided, yeah, we ought to try doing that. And that was the genesis of all of it. It wasn't some big plan. There weren't any organizations behind it. It was just a few of us that decided we had to do something.
But it exploded. So that tells you something, that both you put God and passionate people together and look out, right?
Yep.
Right. And we heard from a lot of people that, oh, the Tea Party's dead now, and it got really maligned by a lot of different organizations. But the thing was, and we'd hear it over and over, you know, they're not dead by any means. They've decided to go silent for a bit, and I think they're really awake again now. It's not that we're different people. We still believe in the same things, because I'm absolutely admitting I was one of the troublemakers back in the day, but you know, we still believe in freedom. We still believe in the rights of the individual. We still believe in a lot of those things. And I think that kind of leads us into the Convention of States that you're now a part of. And how did that get launched then?
Yeah, you know, it does come partially out of the fading of the Tea Party movement. And I do want to address that because I get that question all the time. What happened to the Tea Party movement? And over the last 13 years, having been involved in a political movement and helped to lead it, I've become a student of movements. And one of the things that I've seen about movements is if they are successful, they ultimately go away. And that sounds maybe counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is when a movement is successful, it becomes part of the governance of a place, of a city or a state or a country. If it doesn't, then by nature, it's not successful. And so what we saw in the Tea Party movement is what you see in all successful movements is that people who were involved in the movement, like you, went on to do different things. They grew up in politics because of their involvement in the Tea Party movement. The movement accomplished the largest congressional swing between parties since 1938. That was back in 2010. And then a lot of us went on to do other things. People ran for office themselves. They became political consultants. They became campaign managers. They joined school boards and city councils. And so the movement itself as a cohesive force, I would argue, faded. Also partially because of the IRS's attack on the Tea Party movement, targeting Tea Party members, preventing them from getting their 501c3 and C4 designations. We ultimately litigated that, and we filed a class action lawsuit against the IRS, which they had to settle for $3.7 million. So that pushed a lot of people out, but a lot of us just went on to do other things. And for me, the reason that I got involved in the Convention of States movement was through a gentleman by the name of Mike Ferris. And Mike Ferris, in my opinion, is an absolute genius. I think he rises to the level of the founding fathers. He founded the homeschool movement in America. He was a father of 10 and believed that we had a fundamental right to homeschool our own kids, teach them what we wanted them to learn and in the ways that we wanted them to learn. Homeschooling was illegal in all 50 states in one way or another in the 1970s. Mike founded Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He then went on to found Patrick Henry College, a great conservative Christian college in Purcellville, Virginia. And he came to me one day and he said, are you happy with what you've accomplished in politics? My answer was, no, I'm miserable because I feel like I've done everything I know how to do. We got a bunch of great people elected, and then they all got eaten by the swamp. And Mike said to me, well, that's because you're approaching the problem incorrectly. We don't have a personnel problem. We have a structure problem. Over the last 115 years or so, we've broken the structure of governance in Washington, D.C., the structure given to us by the framers of our Constitution. We need to make those structural fixes, because when you have a bad system or a broken system and you put good people into a broken system, you get broken results. And so that's really what convinced me to start working to use Article 5 of the Constitution to bring about a structural fix to what ails our country.
Speaking of Article 5 of the Constitution, I want to draw people's attention to your website, conventionofstates.com. And when you go to the website, you invite people to sign the petition. And here's what the petition says. I support Convention of States, a national movement to call a convention under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, restricted to proposing amendments that will impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit its power and jurisdiction, and impose term limits on its officials and members of Congress. And so how is that, kind of elaborate, how is that going to fix things?
Yeah, I mean, those three areas are really important. This is what the American people care about, and these are the three fundamental structural areas where we have a problem. Number one is folks are fed up with people being in Washington, D.C. forever. I would say that applies to Congress, but importantly, you know, I would call it maybe the Fauci Amendment. We don't need bureaucrats in the federal government for 40 years. Ultimately, they become the most powerful politicians in America, but they're unaccountable. So term limits on them really matters. I would say imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government. We all know the federal government is financially out of control, 31 trillion in debt, more every single year. The spending is out of control. We're going to have to impose a balanced budget amendment, tax caps and spending caps, things like that. And third, and I think most importantly, are jurisdictional and scope restraints on the federal government. Federal government was intended by the Constitution to be bound by the enumerated powers, 17 powers, limitations imposed by the Constitution. Today, it seems like they have 17 million. Mostly that's because of court decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court expanding the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government. So we need to limit those things as well.
So can you maybe explain, is a convention of states the same thing as a constitutional convention, or are they different? Can you maybe just let us know a little bit about that?
Sure. I hear this all the time that, you know, people refer to this as a quote unquote con. That's meant to be pejorative. They're referring to a constitutional convention. People who say that don't understand legal language. Look, we're dealing with the Constitution. It's the ultimate legal language in America. So you have to understand the language from a legal perspective. A constitutional convention, I'm going to use a big legal word, is a plenipotentiary convention. And that means a convention that has all the power it wants to do anything that it wants to do. It operates in an unfettered way. And an Article 5 convention actually operates within the boundaries of the United States Constitution. It's limited to the applications passed by the states. It takes 34 states to pass the same application to get into convention. And so that's not an all-powerful convention. It is a limited convention. And that is the difference between a constitutional convention and a convention for proposing amendments under Article 5.
And so when North Dakota has continued to renew the resolution to be a part of, be one of those 34 states, those three enumerated things that we just put up on our screen, that is what they voted on. Is that correct? It was in the vote that they took. They knew what this was going to involve by those three items, correct?
That's correct. All the applications contain those three items. Every state that's passed it, there are 19 states that have passed it so far. So when North Dakota passed it, that was the same application. The legislature knew that they were voting on something limited to those three things. And quite frankly, if they didn't believe they were voting on a limited application, first of all, I wouldn't be advocating for it. And second, certainly the North Dakota legislature would have never passed that.
Right. And, you know, and we're also hearing then that we won't have any idea if they would call this constitutional or this convention of states, where you'd have your 34 states that said yes. Then we would have no control over who the delegates were. We have no control of them getting there and saying, hey, we're just going to toss out whatever brought us here and we're going to start from scratch. Is that even possible to do, those two things?
No, I hear those assertions being made, and those are honestly ridiculous assertions being made by people who are either disingenuous and dishonest or ignorant of the truth. The reality is it takes 34 states to call a convention. We don't get to convention unless 34 states, a supermajority, agree on exactly what the convention is going to be about. And the idea that I've heard the idea all the time that Congress will appoint the delegates. If you believe that, then you believe that the framers were idiots quite simply because they propose this second method of amending the Constitution specifically to wire around a potentially out of control federal government. So Congress isn't included, the president is not included. This is intended to wire around them. This will be controlled completely by the states. The states will appoint their own commissioners to the convention. The delegates are technically called commissioners, and they will be controlled by the states the entire time that they're at convention.
When we come back, we need to help people understand this a little bit more, including myself, how this would all work and what hope you have for making getting enough states, 34 states. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ladies of Another View. I'm Beck, and I also want to welcome back our guest, Mark Meckler, who's the president of Convention of States. And I really want to direct your attention. First, welcome back, Mark.
Thank you.
I want to point people to your website once again, because we can only do so much on the show, but you can learn a lot more if you go to conventionofstates.com. It's at the bottom of your screen. Mark, give us your elevator speech. What is it that you're about?
You know, I think that's a really important question because we can get buried in the complications and the nuance of Article 5. But the reality is this, that we have a fundamental fight that we're having in America today. And it's different than what most people think. Most people think it's about what the politicians want us to fight about. That's what should we do on any given issue. But the reality is the main fight is not about what should we do, it's about who should decide. So the question is, do you think Washington, D.C. should decide for people in North Dakota and all across the country, or do you think North Dakotans should decide for themselves? And folks who believe that the who decides question is answered by me and my family, me and my church, me and my community, me and my state, not a bureaucrat thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., then they're probably in favor of the Convention of States, because the goal of Convention of States is to take the power away from D.C. and give it back to regular people in the state. So that's sort of the summary of Convention of States.
Mm-hmm. And so we talk about, like, then the people are choosing our representatives, but like, what is the process of that? How do we ensure, because technically right now the people they've chosen their elected officials already, and then we see all that goes on and just the distrust and the lying and deceitfulness that truly happens in a lot of politics. That's getting into the weeds also. But so how do we know that when we're choosing these officials, how do we go about that? What's the process behind that? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the way the process works is a state passes their resolution, simple majority of both houses. That's what North Dakota's done. Once that resolution is passed, it stays on file. And then when we get to 34 states, the convention will be called. When that happens, then North Dakota will choose their commissioners or delegates. They're technically called commissioners. The state legislature will choose the commissioners. Every state receives one vote. Important to note, because this is a convention of states, not a convention of delegates or population. So North Dakota will have the same vote that California or Texas would have, one state, one vote. And those commissioners chosen by the legislature will then be under the dominion and control of the legislature the entire time they're at convention. They'll be given instructions called commissions, which are written instructions on that which they may do or may not do while they're at convention. If they were to operate outside of those commissions, they can be withdrawn by the state legislature at any time. So the state absolutely controls the process all the way through. If 26 states or a simple majority of states agree on any amendment proposal, this is very important, it becomes a suggestion. The convention itself is nothing to be afraid of. All the convention can do is make suggestions, and then those suggestions are sent out to the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. That's 38 states.
Wow. So, you know, it would seem to me that protocol being followed, it's kind of hard to get 34 states to agree on anything unless they think it's for the betterment of our country. It looks like you agree with that. I see you shaking your head. Right, right. So maybe, you know, can you talk to us about the momentum of this, where we're at as a nation, you know, as far as people that are involved? Do you have any numbers? And also, are there any names that our viewers would recognize that are perhaps part of this movement?
Yeah, let's start with the names. I think that's really important. And I got to say, I'm truly humbled as I list off some of these names. It's not because of me. And we started this whole conversation about God is in it. That's how this all starts. That's what it all goes back to for me. But the first endorser really was Mark Levin. Mark wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments that was all about this. And literally, it was Providence. That book launched the same week that this organization launched to call for an Article 5 convention. Sean Hannity is an endorser. Charlie Kirk, I would argue the leader of the conservative youth movement in the country, is an endorser. You've got professors all across the country. Ben Shapiro is an endorser. Pretty much any nationally known conservative whose name you would know off the top of your head, if they've spoken about Convention of States, they're in favor of Convention of States. It's a little bit overwhelming to me, to be honest with you.
That's pretty powerful stuff, I think. And so, are we at a place where, are there any laws on the books that could prevent our states from being able to operate within the confines of what you've described?
Yeah, there aren't actually. I hear this all the time that people say, oh, they're trying to push laws in Washington, D.C. But it's important to remember we're operating under the Constitution of the United States of America in calling an Article 5 convention. The states have that right, and there's nothing that Congress can do legally to limit that right. Congress has never passed a law attempting to limit that right. I hear people who are our opponents occasionally say, well, there have been laws proposed in Congress limiting that right. It is indeed true that people have tried a bunch of times to introduce laws in Congress limiting that right. None of those laws, as far as I'm aware, have ever even made it into a committee, let alone out of committee and onto the floor. That's because Congress has no right to limit the states in regard to the exercise of their Article 5 powers.